Hello, everyone. Welcome to the OECD webinar on adaptive economies, strategies for resilient regional policymaking. We are here today from, if I start in the West, from Canada, US, Mexico, Peru, even IMF, in the central part of the globe from all over Europe, Israel, Russia, Turkey, going onwards to the east, we have registered people from India, Taiwan, Korea, Australia. So I could say, we are the world in a way today here, which shows that how relevant the topic is, how relevant the future of different territories, and in particular the weaker ones, the rural areas, is for the transition to the new normal. Now, in 2018, the OECD had a Rural Development Conference in Edinburgh, and three major statements were put forward there. One, that rural areas are places of opportunities and are vital for inclusive growth. Secondly, that they are specific, and in order to thrive, which is the third message, that innovation in that process will be critical. On that basis, by 2019, when a new Rural Development Conference was held in Seoul, Rural Innovation Project was born with participation from Canada, US, Scotland, Switzerland, and Japan, which really brought together thinking about what we can do to change the future of rural areas for the better. And it's in the framework of that project that today's webinar is being conducted. Now, this is an essential part of what OECD does, but it's only a part of a much broader and systemic way to promote the so-called place-based approach. And that's why I'm glad that I'm able to first invite Nadim Ahmad, who is the Deputy Director of Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities of the OECD, to give us a better flavor of not just what the OECD is doing on rural, but also how does that link in to the bigger picture. Nadim, I pass the floor to you.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. And that's a $1 million question, I think, in terms of how it fits into the bigger picture. And I guess in the 5 minutes that I have, I'm going to struggle to fill that bigger picture. But perhaps I'll try to do some of that in my opening remarks. But before I do so, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you that have joined us from all over the world, as you said, Peter, especially those delegates from the OECD's Regional Development Policy Committee. But also a special thank you to Amin Toufani, who's here today with us to give us this inspiring presentation that I hope that will illuminate an awful lot of the conversation that we want to have around the importance of innovation when it comes to regional policy making. Now, Amir is the CEO of the Silicon Valley-based T-Labs and the founder of adaptabilities.org. He's also an advisory board member of the Rural Innovation Project that you mentioned, Peter. And in today's event, what I'm really hoping to see crystallized is perhaps this real forward-looking discussion around innovation more generally and how it can boost regional policy making. But I think specifically to tackle some of the issues that perhaps requires this type of blue sky thinking, the outside thinking, that means that we don't lose sight of everything. I mean, we have a good knowledge, for example, of some of the known knowns, the role of innovation in terms of driving productivity, the role of innovation improving well-being. But there are lots of other things, for example, that the unknown unknowns, I guess, that are really critical, that we don't lose sight of that. And one could, for example, view COVID as being an unknown unknown, although in some cases some could have said that it was a known known that we should have perhaps better anticipated in our responsiveness measures. But it's those types of issues that I think are going to be crucial. What does the future look like, and how can we navigate our way into that future? And what type of skills do we need? What types of innovations do we need to be basically aware of in that process? And I think that this conversation and our ability to try to anticipate basically these unknown unknowns and indeed known unknowns is going to be crucial in terms of making sure that we have that resilience built into the system, that resilience that's, I think, becoming the key word in the policy discussion. a lot of the work that we've done over the years as part of the rural wellbeing framework that many of you are, of course, very familiar with, it has already given us lots of insights in terms of perhaps some of the structural factors that we see that hold rural communities back. And those, perhaps what's really important in all of that is a recognition that what we're referring to here is a heterogeneity of rural communities. You've spoken about a number of different countries around the world, and within those countries, of course, the rural communities themselves are all basically having to navigate and tackle these spatial challenges, but spatial challenges that may represent themselves in different ways, depending on how close you are to a city, how basically far away you are from cities. And these are all challenges, I think, that need to be factored into our thinking when we think about policy making more generally, and in particular, the role of innovation in driving our resilient policy making. So I don't want to say a huge much more than that, perhaps just to emphasize a few key really important points here. I mean, the first, of course, is that the COVID has in itself exacerbated many of the existing inequalities that we saw. The existing inequalities that built on inequalities that existed in other domains, for example, in access to digital infrastructure, the digital skills, the digital readiness of rural communities. Those are all factors that we're aware of, and we know they're going to have to be factors that we try to address going forward. But of course, we have other megatrends like the green transition, and the green transition provides challenges, but also opportunities for rural communities. And again, place-based, they're heterogeneous across different rural spaces. And so those are things that I think we need to factor into our thinking. The OECD's regional outlook that was released only a few weeks ago talks an awful lot about those challenges. And I certainly encourage those of you who are with us today to take a close look at it, because of course you'll see the real importance of making sure that we can have that specific place-based policy making in our narrative. I'm not going to say much more than that, because like I said, I think that what I want to hear from today, and I think that we all want to hear from today, is Amir's views on some of these challenges. And in particular, like I said, the things that we don't yet know that we should know about. And I think that's really, critical to today's event. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor back to you, Peter, and then look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadim, for this introduction. Indeed, I mean, what I realized in the last couple of years is that if we want to deliver new future, new vision for rural, stereotypes will need to fall. Things will need to change. We need to go beyond the usual. We need to think outside. We need to go outside of the comfort zone. And that's the reason why, together with the OECD team, we approached today's webinar in the way we have, inviting someone as a keynote who is not an insider to the place-based approaches, but someone who is focusing on finding new ways of making sense of the world, as Amin puts it in his CV, who wants to go beyond the cutting edge and is all about change, a change to improve lives and livelihoods. Again, something from his CV. Just to mention, additionally from what Amin does now, he's also a parallel entrepreneur with active projects in artificial intelligence, biotech, organizational performance, and quantitative trading. He has degrees in artificial intelligence, economic policy, and MBA. And he has also simultaneously pursued and received graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford University at the same time. Not many people can claim that to be the case. But we were explicitly told that we do not want to overpromise in the beginning, because at the end, each of us will need to find our own specific answers. This is something that I would encourage all of you, all of us, to also exchange during the presentation via chat. In particular, how will the forthcoming technologies cumulatively affect rural, your rural, because each rural is different, and what can governments do, and how policies can be changed and reformed to make good use and capitalize on those changes. So Amin, please do push us out of the comfort zone. And with that, I would pass the floor from Ljubljana over to the US, to the Silicon Valley, which I understand is also undergoing some fundamental territorial transformations. Amin,
very true.
The floor is yours. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Peter and Nadim, the rest of the OECD team. Thank you so much for making this opportunity possible. Ladies and gentlemen, such a privilege to be here with you. Thank you for the gift of your attention. I think we live in an amazing world, and I want to take you back to October 20th, 1968, specifically to the Mexico Olympics, where this happened. This might not seem like anything extraordinary, but consider this. Up until this moment in history, every athlete in the world had jumped either like this or like this. Nobody had ever jumped like this. And this lady right here knows exactly what just happened. She knows she just witnessed an historic unlearning, a great unlearning moment when everything changed in that split second. From that moment on, Richard Fosbury's technique has been the only technique to be taught, to win world records, and it's understood that this is the way to do it. So my question for you, ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of today's conversation is, what will your Fosbury moment look like? What will you unlearn? What can we look to the future to inspire us to do in our own regions as we build competitiveness? Because we live in an amazing world. In the last 100 years, life expectancy has more than doubled. Today, integrated circuits are more than 30,000 times faster than they were in the 1960s. Solar panels are more than 250 times cheaper since 1975. DNA sequencing is 100,000 times cheaper since 2001. We're seeing exponential growth in biotech, nanotech, and information technology. So when you hear me talk about exponential technologies, these are some of the technologies that I'm referring to. Consider this. All of these devices from around 25 years ago fit in our pockets. And when you compare this device to the device that put man on the moon, we're looking at 200,000 times the speed and 2 million times the memory. Neil Armstrong is not very impressed. 90% of all recorded data was created in the last 2 years. Today, medical knowledge is doubling every 80 days, doubling, not increasing by a certain percentage, literally doubling. If you look at the number of publications, is your doctor keeping up with this? I don't think so. We're beginning to see science fiction turn into science fact. Today, there are animals that live in this world that have outlived their normal lifespan by more than 100%. This is the equivalent of you and I living to be 140 years old. Let's switch gears. That's biotech. What about energy? Solar price per watt has been dropping exponentially. Number of panel installations has been growing exponentially. So solar is one of those rare technologies that seems to be growing double exponentially. Now, who does not get this message? The International Energy Agency. Every year, these guys produce a report called the World Energy Outlook. And in this report, you can see in the colored lines here, these are the projections made by the International Energy Agency every single year for the growth of solar. The black line is the actual growth of solar. In other words, these folks have been reliably wrong. Now, since publishing a lot of these incorrect reports, they have course corrected a little bit. But why is it so difficult to make sense of exponential trends? Here's why. This gentleman, Steve Sasson, one of my heroes, he invented the digital camera while working, of all places, at Kodak. Yes, Kodak. Now, that's the device that he is holding in his hand. Compared to that device, the phone in your pocket has a camera that has 2,000 times the resolution, 1,000 times lighter, and 2,000 times cheaper. Combined, you're looking at a 4 billion-fold improvement. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a question. If somebody shows up with a new technology, with version 1 of a new technology, and they say this is going to change the world, are you prepared to look at that version 1 and project it 4 billion-fold improved in the next 20, 30 years? This is absolutely impossible for the human brain to imagine, but we need to unlearn these patterns of linearity and recognize that the world seems to be changing exponentially. We think before the end of this decade, we're going to see 5 critical moments in human history. We call these the 5 supremacies. I'm referring to quantum supremacy, blockchain supremacy, solar supremacy, biotech supremacy, and AI supremacy. Quantum supremacy is the moment when quantum computers become more powerful than conventional computers. Blockchain supremacy is the moment when the blockchain architecture for a database becomes more useful than conventional databases. It's not about cryptocurrencies, although that is innovative too. It's more about the architecture for the database. Solar supremacy is the moment when solar, without the marginal cost of solar, without government subsidies, goes lower than any other form of energy. And in many parts of the world, as you guys know, this is already happening. Biotech supremacy we define as the moment that where more than half of the population believes the biology they were born with is not sufficient and they would like to improve on it. And AI supremacy is when AI becomes more powerful than conventional computers and the human brain in the vast majority of business applications. And we think all of these 5 supremacies are going to happen before 2030, and they seem to be gaining momentum towards 2025. Now, let's take a step back. You might say, I mean, you're talking about exponential technologies. But we all know the last year has kind of looked like this. Yes, it is true. We have had a crazy year, and we can all agree that this year has tested our patience and perseverance. But if you take a step back and look at the growth of one particular exponential technology, the price performance of computers, computational power, over the last 120 years, there's literally no sign of the First World War, the Second World War, any famines, any geopolitical issues. Literally, the resilience is reflected in this chart by Ray Kurzweil. The exponential pace of technological change, in this case, Moore's Law, is highly resilient. In fact, we've looked at prior episodes of challenge for the human race. And we've noticed that crises tend to accelerate disruptive trends. And we're all living proof of what we have noticed in the last year in this regard, accelerating disruptive trends. Case in point, Zoom became more valuable last year than all of American-based airlines combined. What does Zoom do? It connects us. We're connected right now via Zoom. What do airlines do? They connect people. So the form might be disrupted, but the function tends to remain. And in other words, for decades, nothing happens. And in weeks, decades happen. This is the shape of disruption, not only for organizations, but also for regions that we have consistently seen. It's amazing, amazing, amazing until it's tragic. And people assume there would be enough time to respond to that. But the truth is you need to posture for that type of disruption long in advance of its arrival. By the way, Zoom is no longer worth $50 billion. Last time I checked, it is worth about $100 billion. The key message here is that exponential technologies tend to create exponential winners and exponential losers. And this is where our adaptive policies for our regions come into play. We need to hyper customize and have that local awareness to end up on the left side here as an exponential winner. Now, speaking of regions and our future readiness in different parts of the world, we are pretty concerned about this triangle that we call the intractable trinity. Exponential technologies have 3 particular impacts on different areas that impact a region. Specifically, we're talking about technological deflation, commodity oversupply, and GDP compression. Let's start with technological deflation. Technology is making things cheaper, faster, and more accessible. Progressively, this is leading to deflation. On one hand, we have technological deflation, but on the other hand, what are we doing? We're printing a lot of money. What do you get when you print a lot of money? You have inflation. You're supposed to get inflation, but we're not getting that right now. I think we're going to look back at this period in human history and recognize that on one hand, technological deflation was counterbalancing what on the other hand was a very inflationary set of monetary policies. And this is the demarcation between the inflationary era and the deflationary era. And by the way, if you're trying to solve cancer, you absolutely love deflation. If you're trying to innovate, you love deflation. It means you go to bed, you wake up, everything is cheaper. Now, commodity oversupply. When the marginal cost of energy drops, when transportation becomes autonomous, all of this leads to a rush to the bottom because resource extraction and transportation becomes cheaper and cheaper. And commodity oversupply is a very pronounced phenomenon in certain parts of the world already. GDP compression refers to the fact that if you actually solve cancer today, you will positively destroy global GDP. Now, GDP is a great measure of momentum, is a horrible measure of direction. right? GDP does not have a sense of good and bad. GDP is an aggregate measure of momentum. So we need new measures. And like I said, we call this the intractable trinity. Very few countries in the world are prepared for the intractable trinity. I've had the privileged opportunity to meet with 10 presidents and prime ministers in the last 5 years. And let me tell you, not a single one has been prepared for this, because the picture it points to is a deflationary depression. And again, this is where regional resilience comes into play. We need to have a very different set of policies to upgrade our collective imagination. If you want to know what a deflationary depression looks like, we've all seen it before. The case of Japan, the lost decade, comes very close to these set of dynamics. But let me illustrate the intractable trinity for you with a practical example. Last year, as you probably heard, we saw the announcement of the million-mile battery. This is an announcement that affects electric vehicles all around the world, every manufacturer. Basically, it means that long after you are done with your car, you pass it on to somebody else. That battery is as good as new. You do not need to change it. You can change vehicles 10 times over, change owners 10 times over, and that battery is still good. Now, the range that you're going to get with electric vehicles is approaching 400 miles, 640 kilometers per charge, and this is going to be surpassed very, very quickly as well. And most importantly, these cars have about 20 moving parts instead of the 10,000 that we typically see in gasoline vehicles. Translation, fewer things will go wrong. You will not need as many mechanics. Now, this combined all of the factors that we're seeing here. Price is going to drop. Cost of production is going to drop. Access is going to increase. People are going to choose access instead of ownership. Why would you own if you can call the car autonomously whenever you need it? Number of accidents will go down. These cars will not run into people, walls, trees, and each other. Health of the population, health of the vehicles, everything effectively goes up, and production volume will drop because we will not need as many vehicles. You combine these, that points to the intractable trinity again. I had a privileged opportunity to have a conversation one-on-one with Dr. Janet Yellen. This was back in November, before she was appointed as a Treasury Secretary. As you know, Dr. Yellen ran the central bank for the United States for quite a few years. And as the head of the Federal Reserve, her focus was on monetary policy, but also unemployment and inflation. And the conversation that I had with her was about the intractable trinity. The truth is, governments are seriously unprepared for this trinity, but progressively they're paying a lot of attention to it. And certainly my conversation with Dr. Yellen was very, very encouraging. Speaking of monetary policy, in response to the current crisis, this is how governments have been responding. This is the picture, a very technical picture of monetary policy in today's world, right? Massive printing of money. If you look at the M1 monetary base for the US dollar, $5.7 trillion represents a 44.9% increase. That's a massive increase in the monetary base for any currency. Which brings us to a quick review of how to central bank. Step number one, you want to start with a question, assessment. Do you need money? The answer has been yup for most countries around the world. Step number two, let's take measured action. We need to print money. Monetary policy has been very, very expansionary because we need to basically support our systems with the additional printing of money. Okay, great. Step number three is evaluation. Did you cause inflation greater than 2%? The answer has consistently, for the last decade and a half, has been fairly consistent with no, we did not cause that inflation. Great, awesome. Let's move back to step number two and repeat. This is the formula that a lot of central banks, Bank of Japan, the ECB, European Central Bank, the Fed in the US, everybody has been using this formula. It seems sound based on historical forecasts, but if you do the retrocast, this is a very different picture. You start with the future and move backwards. The reason is what we believe is happening here is we're printing a lot of money, which is inflationary in nature, but on the other hand, technological deflation is counterbalancing it. Now, in reality, the danger here is that after step number 4, you do not go back to step number 2. In reality, you have a parallel stream here, which leads to bubbles. You create asset bubbles. That type of money printing, that type of inflationary monetary policy leads to bubbles. In fact, it could eventually lead to a currency debasement. Now, I personally take issue with the fact that the Dow Jones Industrial Average right now is tracking very closely to the COVID curve. There's something wrong with the picture when these two curves look so similar. And if you're looking for evidence of technological deflation, you need to remove the monetary effect of a currency. All the currencies that we have today are inflationary currencies. You print more money, you cause inflation. There's a central bank that controls the volume. What if you cap the total supply of money? Bitcoin has done that. Now, there's a lot of issues with cryptocurrencies. I'm certainly not advocating for them in this context, but they're very demonstrative when you look at technological deflation. Take, for example, PlayStation 3, 4, and 5, 2009, 2013, and 2020. The price of a PlayStation has been consistently set by Sony to be around $500, and inflation deflationary currency. But let's look in terms of Bitcoin. In 2009, you would pay 421,000 Bitcoins. In 2013, you would pay 1.7 Bitcoins. 2020, you would pay 0.03 Bitcoins. So that's a clear reflection of a deflationary currency demonstrating deflationary dynamics. But let's zoom out. The big picture here is production cost is dropping. The marginal cost of production is approaching zero in many different industries. Ease of entry into different domains is going up. It's easier to compete in new industries. Automation is on the rise, and distribution costs are dropping as well, not the least because of cost of energy and automation. You combine all of these factors, and that means in most industries, we're headed towards a pretty serious oversupply and consolidation scenario. We have yet to find an industry that is future-proof, that is not subjected to these key dynamics. Translation, we will not need as many banks, retailers, theaters, factories, employees, cars, buildings, consultants, etc. Now, this is a pretty stark picture. And at the core of this picture, believe it or not, is a message of technological empowerment. I know it's hard to believe, but what we're noticing today for the first time in human history is that people, because of these exponential technologies, people seem to be doing what companies used to do, and companies seem to be doing what governments used to do. There's this cascading effect of technological empowerment. People ask me, what are governments doing? Well, I think governments are not doing enough. They need to be doing more, because for the first time in history, governments need to compete with each other very closely, very similarly to how companies compete with each other. What are they competing for? Thanks to digitization and mobility, governments are competing for talent and capital. And a lot of them are not winning. Case in point, in the United States today, 22% of Americans either have relocated due to COVID or know someone who has. When you zoom into a region like Silicon Valley, 80%, this number jumps to 80% of the population. Now, why are people leaving? Why is there this exodus? Why are rural areas suddenly become incredibly attractive? People are looking for three things: tax incentives, ease of work, and quality of life. Ultimately, this is what everybody cares about, especially if the internet is coming from above, which it will very, very soon. Let's unpack these a little bit more. Tax incentives, personal, corporate, resident, and non-resident is what I'm referring to. Ease of work, digital government, legal ease, innovation sandbox, which we're going to talk about in a second. Quality of life, pretty simple stuff: cultural safety, financial security, and healthcare. Now, governments are going to try to attract talent and attract capital. They've been doing this for a while, but today the game is a little different. We are trying to attract the best talent and attract the best capital. If you're after the best, the only way to do this is to create the great innovation sandbox in your region. How do you create a great innovation sandbox? The formula is actually pretty straightforward. There are 5 elements to it. Think of these as the 5 key enablers of turning your region into a super node for innovation. Basically, you're solving critical problems that very few regions have truly solved. Number 1 is robust financial systems. Basically, we need both financing and a fintech infrastructure as rocket fuel for innovation. We also need sizable tax breaks. Return on investment can be huge if you promote upskilling, innovation, and unlearning, very, very specifically. And next one is thoughtful deregulation. We're going to come back to this. We'll talk a lot about this in the rest of today's session. And then inventive incentive models. If you do not want to promote cookie cutter industries, I can't say and emphasize this enough. If you're supporting another, food producer, yet another clothing manufacturer, another shampoo maker, you might be wasting the creative capacity of your region. The world really does not need another shampoo maker. The world needs people and organizations that are going to tackle innovation problems that have not been solved before. And this is where this pathway to safe failures becomes so critical, because tough problems lead to a lot of failures, but it does not need to be the end game. In fact, in regions like Silicon Valley, if you look at it, the game they have perfected is you can fail and you can try again. That pathway to failure is very elegant, is very forgiving. I always joke that I've never done anything well that I hadn't done badly first. As policymakers, we want to create a safe environment for people to get the badly done first out of the way, instead of reverting back to cookie cutter industries that have a proven pathway. They're safe, but they don't do much for society and for humanity. And you want to make working in innovation irresistible. You want to go straight to the top of the food chain, which means you want to create an incredible innovation pathway. And ultimately, if all of this sounds pretty impossible, consider this quote by Nelson Mandela: "It is always impossible until it is done." Pretty inspiring. So next time you're trying to enter your vehicle, consider the Fosbury flop. In all seriousness, let's talk about 7 strategies for adaptive economies in an exponential world. And I want to zoom in on one particular domain initially. We looked at more than 300 businesses that have grown exponentially in the last 2 decades. We did this because I run an incubator for ideas that we generate. My wife and I decided to put all of our life savings into projects that we care about. And you'll hear about some of these projects in the next few minutes. But in the process of building these companies, we were very interested in understanding businesses that have grown exponentially. So we looked at more than 300 businesses that have grown exponentially in the last 2 decades, and we looked for patterns, and pretty convincing patterns emerged. I've done a full talk on this online. You can have a look at that, but this is how the exponential business models framework was born. I want to highlight one key idea from this research that I think is very impactful as you come up with regional strategies for innovation and global competitiveness. What we noticed is that the common denominator across all of these businesses was this: they focused on digital twinning. What is digital twinning? Digital twinning refers to creating a digital representation of people, property, and processes. Basically, look around yourself and ask yourself, the people you're interacting with, the properties you're interacting with, processes that are involved in your day-to-day lives, do they have a digital representation? If not, go ahead and try to capture that digital twin and recognize that you might be sitting on top of an exponential business model. Because it turns out the vast majority of disruption stories out there can be explained through this triangle. Somebody figuring out how to create a digital twin to deliver more value. Because the moment you have a digital representation, the moment you have the digital twin, you can unleash the power of all of these exponential technologies to create exponential value. Let me give you a concrete example of this. Let's try this together. Let's think about a bicycle accident, for example. What if we could look at thousands of accidents and create a nearly perfect digital twin of the physical process of a person falling from a bicycle? Literally looking at thousands of accidents, understanding, digitally mapping what happens in that final second. Well, this is exactly what a company out of Sweden did. And this is what they came up with. This airbag takes 1/10 of a second to inflate. Pretty incredible. Now you might be wondering, is this safer than a bicycle helmet? Not only is it safer, it is in fact 8 times safer. If you're in a bicycle accident involving head impact, you're 90% likely to end up with head trauma if you're wearing a helmet. But with hoofding here, this airbag, it drops to 2%, from 90% to 2%. An incredible demonstration of the power of digital twinning, creating a digital representation. And in fact, if you look at the vast majority of innovation stories out of Silicon Valley, these are digital twin innovation stories. Uber created a digital twin for cars and people. Airbnb digital twin for homes and availability. Facebook digital twin for your social network. Yelp digital twin for public opinion. Fitbit digital twin for your physical activity. Slack digital twin for team conversations. Now, digital twinning can actually save lives as well. I'm going to show you a car accident here. Let me warn you, it's a pretty serious accident, but it's not fatal. Have a look. We're watching this accident from the dash cam of a Tesla. Now, like I said, we're watching from the Tesla, and hopefully everybody heard the beep. There's a moment in the video where you hear a beep. The beep is the first moment that the car detects something is wrong, and it applies the brakes automatically. I'm going to play the video again. This time I'll pause at the beep. Does this look like an accident to you, ladies and gentlemen? This is 1.7 seconds before the actual accident. What's happening is the car is scanning 2 cars ahead. It has a digital twin of the physical reality, and it's saying that there's no way that car is going to stop, so I'm going to stop you right here. It's an incredible example of the power of digital twinning. Now, while we're on the topic of self-driving cars, consider this. These self-driving cars are going to be here much sooner than most people realize. In fact, in Silicon Valley, we live a few blocks away from the world's busiest intersection for self-driving cars. And it's always tempting when you're next to them to do a little bit of this, to contribute to the training of the AI, you know? We actually don't do that. But Self-driving cars are going to do a few things. They're going to dramatically reduce car accidents and fatalities. They're going to have a massive army of unemployed drivers. They're going to create unemployed bus drivers, truck drivers, taxi drivers, Uber drivers. We're also going to have reduced car ownership because, again, if cars can drive themselves, you don't need to own a car. You can call one whenever you need to, and it can take you wherever you want to go. Let's put some numbers on these. Unemployed drivers, in the vast majority of economies we've looked at, that's at least 1% of the workforce. Reduced car ownership, that is at least 2% of the GDP. And this part kills me. In the vast majority of countries we've looked at, 3% of the GDP comes from the death and injuries caused by car accidents. This is unbelievable. This is ridiculous. And it needs to go away. And it will. Let's combine these. That's 5% of GDP and 1% of the workforce who is extremely angry. We need to unlearn a lot of things to be able to survive and thrive in this new world. And we will. I have full faith in humanity because of our collective adaptability. More on that in a second. But we're beginning to see what we call distance erasers, factors that are making distance irrelevant. And I would argue that the dichotomy between urban and rural is actually beginning to be erased as well as an extension of this theme. We've now seen that how, thanks to the internet, progressively food, entertainment, and work are coming to people instead of people going to them. And we also know that the internet very soon is going to come from above, not from a cable, but from above. Amazon, SpaceX, Starlink, all of these projects are working on delivering the internet from above. But this is just the beginning of a much bigger revolution. An area that has to be on all of our radars is eVTOLs, electrical, vertical, takeoff and landing vehicles. These vehicles, which are going to have commercial availability by 2023. There are literally hundreds of startups and large teams from large companies that are working on this. In this case, we're seeing the Embraer version of an eVTOL. It's unbelievable because it is going to create orders of magnitude reduction in time and cost of transporting people and goods. And in fact, this is going to be the beginning of a truly 3D revolution in mobility. 3D mobility is right around the corner because of the orders of magnitude reduction in cost and time. And it's not just going to be people and small packages. It is going to be autonomous cargo drones. You might also want to consider canceling that Newport project because autonomous cargo drones are coming. And today, their biggest rate-defining challenge is regulatory issues. This is fantastic news for policymakers, because what we can do is we recognize the massive opportunity for our regional innovation sandbox. Remember the sandbox that I talked about? This is a great opportunity. Every time you see a rate-defining challenge in a domain being regulatory, that is your opening. That is your massive opportunity to thoughtfully deregulate and create a very safe environment for organizations, for innovators to experiment without impact on your people, without negative impact, I should say, but definitely very, very potentially positive impact. So this is one category of distance erasers. Another category is this. Epic Games raised $1 billion recently to build the metaverse. Now, you might wonder about Epic Games. You've all interacted with Epic Games. If not you, your children have. Epic Games created Fortnite. And these guys just raised $1 billion to create a super high-resolution digital twin of our world called the metaverse. And trust me, it is not going to look like this. In fact, it is going to look more like this. What you're seeing here is not a movie. This is not studio produced. This is being rendered in real time using a game engine called Unreal Engine 5. Think about this level of resolution. If we had this type of a digital twin of our physical world, we can not only replicate the physical world, we can do so much more. We can improve on it. And our projection is that people will spend orders of magnitude more time in this universe, the metaverse, than what we're seeing right now. This is just the beginning of the trend. We're on the cusp of a truly massive revolution. And in fact, if you're trying to get a glimpse of this today, try an Oculus headset. Oculus Quest 2 is the latest version that they've come out with. Now, you might be surprised to learn that 20% of Facebook employees work on virtual reality, 20%. And if you think this is just, a big fad and there's really momentum that is temporary, consider this. I want to share a personal anecdote with you. One of our favorite fun activities between my wife and I is playing table tennis. We absolutely love playing ping pong. Now, we've always wanted to get a ping pong table. It's very bulky, it's very big, as you know, you need space in the house, but we've always planned to buy one. Now, recently we got the Oculus headset, the latest version. We'd had prior versions, but we got the latest version. And we downloaded a table tennis simulation called 11. It took us 25 seconds from the moment we put this headset on, playing this game, to both look at each other and say, we're never buying a physical ping pong table ever. Why? Because the physics that they have been able to replicate in this game is absolutely phenomenal, mind-boggling. There are professional ping pong players, table tennis players, who cannot believe how accurately this is replicating game dynamics. And this is, again, just the beginning. With every technology that I'm sharing with you, this is the worst version it will ever be. It is only going to improve from this point moving forward. Now, evolution of products and services is a theme that we obsess over. And we have noticed that you can look at any product or service and project its future fairly accurately with three key trends. You want to ask yourself three key questions. Number one, whether the virtual digital connected version of it exists, of that product or service. If not, go ahead and build it immediately. That's a massive opportunity. Or in your innovation ecosystem, in your sandbox, promote the creation of the virtual digital connected version. We're also seeing the rise of just-in-time delivery, the Uberization of different industries, the fact that people want what they want exactly when they want it. Just-in-time delivery is a huge source of value. Now, if the marginal cost of production is dropping so quickly, it also means that you can suddenly hyper-customize your value proposition. And you can go after the long tail of the market by hyper-customizing that value. And you can apply this to any industry, any type of innovation. Let's say people ask me a lot about the future of education, for example. Future of education is going to be virtual digital connected, just-in-time delivered, and hyper-customized to the learner. And again, I encourage you, as you're trying to map out the innovation pathway for different industries, think through this particular lens. And we have many of our projects at T-Labs are going to involve, they do involve these modalities of innovation for the betterment of human beings. One key element that I think is going to be massively, massively revolutionary, truly a tectonic shift, is when you apply that framework to the world of medicine. In fact, we've coined a term called zeromics, and we think this is going to define the next breakthrough in the world of medicine and biotech, stage zero diagnostics. About a third of us are going to experience cancer in our lives. And that's just one domain of disease. If you detect cancer in stage 1 or 2, survival rates shoot up to 95% plus. It's all about early detection. And today, for the first time in human history, we have the technology. We're beginning to have the technology to have stage 0 diagnostics. That means compared to today, where you show up to a doctor and you say, you know, this hurts, fix me. In the world of zeromics, you're not going to show up to the doctor and say, this hurts. You're going to show up because you've been monitored and the disease that is about to impact you has been detected at stage 0. This is a tectonic shift. It's a massive, massive opportunity for breakthrough innovation in different regions of the world, because again, the rate-defining challenge is regulatory. So please have this on your radar and promote this type of innovation in your environment if you can. It does require thoughtful deregulation, but the moment you have this breakthrough in zeromics, this is going to catch on fire, and there's an opportunity to become a global leader in this. Why? Because of this. Hopefully, you're all convinced that the Earth revolves around the sun. But consider this. For most of human history, people thought that the sun and all the planets revolved around Earth. For thousands of years, this was the accepted model. Now, the moment you put the sun at the center, the model becomes elegant, it just works out, it becomes mathematically tractable, and it's beautiful. In this analogy, the sun is the customer. Too many industries have gotten used to the notion that they are the center of the universe, and disruptors are showing up and they're putting the customer back at the center. This literally defines every pathway of disruption, technological innovation that we have identified. How do you do this? First of all, you put the customer at the center and you recognize that the customer is very busy. She's juggling many different things. So we encourage industrial leaders, innovators, startups to think in the following terms. Think about making your value proposition 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times easier, and 10 times more predictive. In other words, you want to be more like Amazon and Google before it is too late. Why? And 10 times, by the way, is not an exaggeration. This is literally how we start every project at T-Labs. That premise of 10x faster, 10x cheaper, 10x easier, 10x predictive is actually fairly conservative. because exponential technologies create exponential winners and losers, as we talked about. Now, the most critical part of this picture is the fact that exponential winners tend to be disruptors and exponential losers tend to be incumbents. And this creates an issue, ladies and gentlemen, because in today's economies, in modern economies, disruptors tend to die easy and incumbents tend to die hard. They have political clout, they have advocacy, they will lobby. Incumbents die hard, disruptors die easy. In adaptive economies, the picture is flipped. Disruptors die hard, incumbents die easy. If you internalize this message, my work today is done. This is literally one of the most important messages to keep in mind as we're planning for regional resilience. It literally means that you're going to create an environment. If you're truly serious about promoting innovation in a region, it simply means that you're going to need to allow incumbents to die. When you combine these phrases, the fact that in adaptive economies, incumbents die easy, this is really the case for UBI, because many lives will be impacted. Universal basic income is something we believe is going to become much more common before the end of this decade. And that's an entire discussion around who pays for UBI. Will it promote laziness? Headline there is absolutely not. It actually promotes entrepreneurship, and by one indication, 3x improvement or increase in entrepreneurship. And ultimately, many people are going to be out of jobs. Technological unemployment is a massive, massive issue because the pace of change is accelerating and we can only upskill and reskill that quickly. And many people will not have the natural propensity to do that. So UBI will become commonplace in our projections. And it's a retrocast, it's not a forecast. If you forecast UBI, it doesn't go anywhere. But if you retrocast, you ask yourself, in 10 years' time, what would be strange not to have happened? The picture is very, very clear in favor of UBI. By the way, I personally do not believe that we need to work to define our meaning in life. I think we need purpose to define meaning. And that means that working for money is actually one version of purpose. There are many other versions of it. If we can promote our environment, if we can promote our community, if we can serve each other, that's much closer to human nature than working for money. But that's a much deeper philosophical discussion. And I believe it'll become center focus because of the urgency of UBI. Ultimately, what we're seeing in industry after industry after industry is the fact that markets no longer demand products or services. We're seeing a shift away from products and services towards performance. Markets are beginning to demand performance. Nobody cares about your product or service. They care about the performance that it delivers. Let me illustrate this point with an example, and let me set it up for you. Let's say you are the owner of a theater company in Spain. And at your theater, every night you run comedy shows. And the business is great. Everybody loves it. It's fantastic. People keep showing up. They love the shows. It's great. One morning you wake up and you notice that the government has increased the tax rate on theatrical shows from 8 to 21%. They've increased the tax rate threefold on you. Translation, tonight nobody's going to show up. What would you do? How would you respond to this external shock? I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Please go ahead, think about it, and then I'll show you what these guys actually did. All right, here we go.
Pay per laugh, the first comedy shows where you only pay for what you consume. We fitted each seat with a facial recognition system that detects the smile and proposed the following deal to spectators. Entrance will be totally free. If the show produces no laughs, you don't pay anything. However, if you laugh, you have to pay for each smile. Each smile produced is worth 30 euro cents, something that in this day and age is quite a reasonable price. At the end of the show, the spectator could check their laughter account before paying and even share it on social networks. And so that no one would cry for having laughed more than they could afford, the maximum amount to pay was 80 laughs for 24 euros. The average price of the ticket increased by 6 euros. The system was covered by the main national media outlets, and this produced 35% more spectators. Each pay-per-laugh show produced 28,000 euros more ticket money than was normally taken. Currently, the system is being copied in other theatres in Spain. A mobile phone app was created as a system of payment, and the first season ticket was launched for the number of laughs not shown.
When you go to a comedy show, what is your biggest risk? What if it's not funny? That's exactly what these guys de-risk. And ultimately, the question for all of us is this: what is your pay-per-laugh business model? How can you promote the pay-per-laugh business model in your region? And when you think about this, the 10% innovation versus 10x innovation, 10% innovation is about process improvement, cost reduction, digitization. And ultimately, that doesn't get us very far. If we want the truly 10x, we need to unlearn our past success. That's the only way to do this. And I want to be very, very clear. The point is not to become like Silicon Valley. I'm joining you from Silicon Valley at 5 a.m. I'm the only guy in Silicon Valley probably right now who's wearing a tie. But let me tell you this, the goal is not to become like Silicon Valley. In fact, in my assessment, Silicon Valley has sucked at innovation. They're very good at marginal innovation. They're not very good at building deep core innovation. And historically, there was momentum, but they have lost it. The point here is that unless you are disruptively innovative in your region, globalization, these patterns of 3D mobility, these patterns of internet coming from above, and things arriving at different regions without frictions that we have experienced today, it simply means that you're not going to be competitive. The point is, how will you create a thriving economy? The point is not to replicate Silicon Valley, which I do believe has lost a little bit of momentum, and they've lost a sense of orientation. It's all about building and flipping, building companies and flipping them these days. But the truth is, deeper innovation takes a bit longer, and it takes a very different approach that could be very well guided by policy. Policy does play a role, because if you look at the pay-per-laugh business model, it means that globally we're headed towards what we call the Great Convergence. We think this decade will be remembered for the Great Convergence. This is where companies are no longer going to say we're a bank, we're an insurance company, we're a CPG company, we're a media company. Companies are going to say we're a technology company that ensures outcomes. We're a technology company that does banking. We're a technology company that does healthcare. We're a technology company that does media. And then this shift away from products and services towards performance, that is the key message here. That's why progressively, the reason we call it the Great Convergence is that progressively industries are going to guarantee outcomes. They're going to progressively behave like insurance industries. And this, again, requires regulatory support. I'll give you an example of this. There are more than 5,000 companies in the world that will help you hire your best candidate. How many of them guarantee the outcome? Zero. Typically, they do not. At best, they'll give you money back guarantee if the candidate doesn't work out. We have been working on the world's first insurance product for hiring, meaning we will not only help you hire the right candidate, we're so confident in our AI, we're so confident in how we can select the right candidates, and we will literally pay you more than you paid us if it doesn't work out with that particular candidate. If that candidate does not perform, we will literally create that insurance product for you. Now, if you zoom out, the big picture here, the Great Convergence, all these technological developments that we're talking about, the pace of change is accelerating. But there's a problem here, ladies and gentlemen. The pace of human adaptability is not keeping up. It's only increasing linearly. And this is an issue because we are here. Now, you might say, oh, we need smarter people. It turns out IQ used to predict success on the job, but today it only predicts success on the job for the first 2 years on the job. Beyond that, the pace of change is accelerating so much, IQ does not get us far. So what are we missing? With about 40 researchers in the last 7 years, we've been obsessing over a concept we invented called AQ, for the adaptability quotient. If the world is changing faster and faster, then your ability to respond to that change is the strongest predictor of your success. Suddenly, it's about AQ, not IQ. And it turns out that when we started our research program, nobody had ever quantified adaptability. The one thing that is going to get us to this future had never been measured. I believe you cannot manage what you do not measure. That's why we created this research program to quantify adaptability, the adaptability quotient. And today we have. We thought we were measuring one thing. In practice, we noticed there are 10 orthogonal dimensions that predict how well an individual or an organization respond to change with adaptability, with agility. And through our academic partners, what we know today is that AQ predicts job performance, job satisfaction, and life satisfaction. We think our education system is going to be overhauled to move away from an IQ-based system to an AQ-based system. Why? Consider this. People who have high cognitive adaptability, which is one of our 10 dimensions, are 64% more likely to easily adapt to project changes. People who have high adaptive receptivity, their openness to new ideas, are 39% more likely to innovate with insufficient resources. People who have high rational adaptability are 80% more likely to work well with others and handle conflict effectively. Now, here's the most important thing. When we discovered and we developed AQ, my wife and I, we made a commitment to each other. We said we were never going to release this to the world unless there was evidence that every single one of these 10 dimensions is improvable. Because guess what? Nobody needs another label like IQ. If the IQ number you were reported was low, you will always doubt yourself throughout your life. If the number you were given was high, you will carry the burden of expectations. Nobody wins from knowing their IQ because IQ is fixed. But I'm pleased to report to you that every single one of these 10 dimensions, we have now found evidence is improvable, is boostable. You can develop your AQ. AQ is not fixed. And this is why we started Adaptability University, adaptability.org. And we've had the privileged opportunity to serve a number of organizations, for-profit and not-for-profits, and government organizations. And the anchor program is the AQ Boost program, where we help individuals and organizations measure and boost their adaptability. And it's my pleasure to offer 50 free seats to the OECD delegates and affiliates. And I'll share with you the code to waive the fee. I think the fee is normally $2,500. This is going to waive all of that. And it's our gesture of gratitude for the work that the OECD and all of you are doing out there. Because what we're noticing is that there is the great bifurcation in play. We're noticing that society is starting to get bifurcated into two groups, what we call trilinguals and then everybody else. Trilinguals and everybody else. Who are trilinguals? Trilinguals speak three languages. Number one, the language of adaptability and agility, decision-making under uncertainty. Number two, the language of technology and AI. And let me be very clear, it doesn't mean that everybody needs to write code. Everybody needs to create AI. It simply means that everybody needs to understand what technology can do for them. Everybody needs to understand where AI is headed. And then there are enough technical people around to basically develop what you need based on that understanding. And the third language that trilinguals speak is a language of their work and purpose. Notice the job is the third language, not the first language. Because if you have number one and number two, you can pick up the third one on the job. We're noticing that organizations are progressively looking for trilinguals, and they're beginning to only hire trilinguals. This is pretty remarkable. And the question that I have for you is that in your region, what percentage of the population is trilingual versus everybody else? This is the opportunity we have to upgrade our collective workforce, our collective imagination, our collective capabilities to move towards a better world. Not to replicate some region like Silicon Valley, but to have future readiness. Because again, the pattern of disruption in regions, in organizations, in industries is amazing, 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 tragic. That's the world we need to posture for. And I do believe we live in a world which can be described as a crisis of imagination. We are in a crisis of imagination. Why? Because never before have we done so little with so much. If you think about the impact of exponential technologies, we can do so much more than we realize. And most of us are not capitalizing on that. Most regions are not capitalizing on that. We're mistaking busyness with usefulness. Busyness with usefulness. We live in a crisis of imagination, and imagination management, dream management is a policy domain. I personally believe that it needs to be at the core of what regional policy defines. The old Chinese practice of foot binding is thankfully obsolete now. But for thousands of years, it was extremely effective at limiting growth. If this is a tool for foot binding, here are the tools for dream binding. The point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we get what we celebrate, and we are celebrating all the wrong things. The onus is on us to upgrade our collective imagination, because the truth is the following: our reach exceeds our imagination. We can all do so much more than we realize, thanks to these exponential technologies, thanks to the better understanding that we have of each other due to the internet, thanks to digital twinning. Our reach exceeds our imagination. Today, the biggest risk is not thinking big enough. Not thinking big enough. And hopefully we can do it in a way that is considerate of people, that doesn't leave anybody behind, that is inclusive, but that utilizes the power of what we can do today. Technological empowerment is real for you as individual policymakers, for our regions, for individuals in our regions, for every organization out there. So to summarize, let's zoom out and zoom back in. Adaptive economies, 7 strategies for adaptive economies focused on future readiness. Number 1, leveraging digital twins, having trilingual citizenry, preparing for the metaverse. This is where we're going to spend a lot of our time with virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, planning for the great convergence, the fact that people are not going to say we're a bank, they're going to say we're a technology company that does banking, and we also ensure outcomes. Progressively, industries are going to look like insurance industries, preparing for the era of 3D mobility, embracing zeromics. This is going to be a tectonic shift in the way we think about our health, in the way the biotech industry is going to evolve. And again, the breakthrough innovation is still right around the corner. And ultimately, managing our dreams, bigger goals, better dreams. This is your policy domain. We started our conversation with a story of Richard Fosbury. Now, you might be surprised to learn that it took 6 years after his gold medal at the Mexico Olympics for the governing body of the sport to admit that his technique was better. 6 years. 6 years for them to unlearn, despite the phenomenal evidence in front of them. It turns out unlearning is really hard. When you move faster with your adaptability and agility, I want to encourage us to be kind to others. People unlearn at different rates. But the onus is on us to recognize that we might not have 6 years in our regions. To build regional resilience, we need to expedite the process. This is your Fosbury moment, because exponential technologies are non-linear. They're non-linear, and they pose massive opportunities and massive threats at the same time. And let me be very transparent. Not all of our experiments are going to work out. But now is the time to be bold, to take a portfolio approach to innovation instead of a one-shot approach to innovation. I want to conclude with my favorite quote of all time. But first, as I promised you, here's the invitation code on adaptability.org if you'd like to experience that program to measure and boost your own adaptability. It is 100% sponsored by us, so there's no cost to you. Use the code OECD. And then if you'd like to keep in touch with me, this is my personal email address. I would love to hear from you. Here is my favorite quote of all time. Intelligence is hitting a target that nobody else can. Genius is hitting a target that nobody else can see. When you go out there and you try to think outside the box, recognize that for a while, people are not going to understand the target you're trying to hit. They're not even going to see it. But if you stay with it, the genius will be revealed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the gift of your attention. I'll pause here. Let's open it up to thoughts, comments, and reactions and your questions. Thank you.
Excellent, Amin. Thank you very much. I'll start with the on the optimistic side. I liked your kind of inspirational example that you took on the jump from 68. And I remembered, in the ski jumping, which is closer to where I come from, which was, the V-shaped approach. It came, I think, in the end of 90s. And I think it only took 2 years that everybody, kind of took it on board. So perhaps through times, we are actually becoming more adaptive. That said, what you presented today, that is the spear, I would say, that is the spear of the thinking. It is, which is not necessarily consistent with what people experience and see on the ground. And I'll follow the Q&As and what we got from chat through time. Some of the comments actually you addressed while later on in the presentation, but I think they certainly deserve a deeper dive into. Now, the first issue I would kind of challenge you with, which we got from the audience, is this relationship between how much focus to put on disruptive innovation versus incremental innovation, which for rural areas might really be important. So one of the comments was, something that you later explicitly addressed. We cannot. The idea is not to cope Silicon Valleys and what have you. But for rural areas, sure, it's the portfolio approach and the atmosphere that one would ideally seek. But really, when you think about the realities on the ground, which are, sometimes really, much very traditional, rather simple. How do you see this relationship? To what extent this disruptive approach can play versus the incremental approach? What would be your take on that?
No, absolutely. I love the thoughtfulness with which you're framing that question, Peter. I think it comes down to one question. Is it a limiting belief that rural areas cannot do as much as urban areas? In today's world, where the barriers to entry are much lower thanks to these technologies, anybody can take that piece of open source code and create a neural network, a deep learning engine with one line of code in R. What used to take Google an entire lab of people to be able to do, now it takes one line of code by one person in an open source piece of software. So suddenly we find ourselves in a world where our reach exceeds our imagination. That's what I mean. You can do so much more because suddenly technology is allowing you to. Now, this does not apply to every domain. This is not uniform. This does not apply to every region. But the spear, as you put it, the directionality is pretty clear. It's moving in that direction. And ultimately, I think the only barrier that we have that we need to worry about is not technological, is not even education related, is not natural resources that we need for this type of innovation. It's really around imagination. If people are in an economic trap because of their region, then we need to help them get out of there. But the vast majority of regions in the world are no longer in economic traps. They're more like in environments where there is momentum from incumbent industries. And if we're serious about promoting innovation, why? Not for the sake of innovation. I do not believe you want to innovate for the sake of innovation. I believe you want to innovate for future readiness. Because again, those incumbent industries are going to be amazing, amazing, amazing until it's tragic. And that is too late to react with our policy choices. That is the spirit of this conversation around future readiness, around upgrading our imagination, and ultimately boosting adaptability and turning individuals into trilinguals.
True, but you also said, that 6 years might be, too long. One of the comments was, I would completely go, I'm certainly willing to go along by what you said, but actually, probably what you're saying is that the biggest limiting factor is within our heads. And that was indeed one of the comments, to what extent do you think these behavioral insights, the how question for the areas that don't have this spirit in the air, as the godfather of territorial approaches once said. What you mentioned, the capacity of humans to adjust, but given the really short time span, to what extent this will be would you say is realistic to expect that this can be kind of the overall recipe? And to what extent we will be seeing only a couple of, kind of best practice successful examples?
I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to human capacity to adapt and to move with agility. I wouldn't be here speaking as the founder of adaptability.org if that was not my bias. Now, ultimately, this bias is informed by the fact that I've had the privileged opportunity to speak in 34 countries. And let me tell you, in every country, I see that bifurcation. Two groups of individuals, those who have upgraded their imagination. And yes, there is privilege. Yes, there is prosperity. Yes, there is intergenerational impact. But ultimately, we see people who are making do, innovating with incredibly little resources against the backdrop of many people not doing much with a whole lot more. And to me, this is it. This is it. If we're serious about promoting future readiness, and ultimately, I think that's the goal that we all want. That's the point of policy, to make our environment, our population more prosperous, to ensure that future generations inherit a better world than the one we had. The only way to do that is to focus on boosting adaptability. The only way to do that is to create a breakthrough with this limiting belief around how far we can imagine, how far we can go. The pattern that I see is pretty consistent across industry after industry, domain after domain. If you're trying to be future ready, if you're trying to have that element of disruption proofing your industry, your economy, this is what it takes. You simply do not see the future clearly. What you do see is that the type of person who will navigate it successfully, the type of organization that will navigate it successfully, are the most adaptable ones. And ultimately, I think that's where the translation begins, with the expertise of your audience. Everybody here, you guys know much more about policy choices in your region. So the onus is on us to take this framework, to take what these mega trends that we've been talking about and say, which parts of this can I apply immediately? Which parts might take a bit longer for the region to unlearn?
So let me kind of push you towards this more rural thinking a bit more. I
Please.
understand, you know, this is the kind of the idea, the direction in which we should be going. And you were very, in the middle of your talk, you were very optimistic about how rural is becoming more attractive. Just now we've received a question from Jakub from Faroe Islands, actually on that very issue. You know, to what extent would you say this can, you know, what could be those issues? You mentioned some tax incentives. You put a lot of emphasis on the regulatory side, the sandboxes, the approaches. What would you say? To what how far can that go? You know, what would be your really kind of anticipation? But also, have you had any specific examples that, you know, that kind of atmosphere has been created, or is this something that we are, you know, we are at the spear trying to promote and still to be tested out?
You know, the breakthrough moment for me is when you look at the recent challenges that COVID has created. The fact that people realize that actually we already have all the tools we need for many people to work remotely. Not everybody, but for many people. Pardon me. That to me is an example of a crisis of imagination. We had these technologies to work remotely, but suddenly it took a pandemic for us to realize that, yes, we can jump. Now, what has this jump meant? It has meant, if you look, you know, across various regions in Europe or the US, in fact, you'll see that the distinction, the demarcation between what is rural, what is non-rural, what is urban, is actually pretty blurry at the moment. Why? Because anywhere you have access to the internet, you can go. Amazon is delivering to more and more places. So again, work, entertainment, and food tend to come to people much more than ever before. And progressively, we don't need to go to food, entertainment, and work. So if this stuff is coming to us, and again, with 3D mobility, with drone delivery, this is only going to accelerate. With autonomous vehicles, this is only going to accelerate. I really have difficulty finding the demarcation between rural and urban persisting moving forward. I think we're at a moment of geographic liberation, if you will. And if you really want to feel good, you would live as far away from other people in an environment that you control. You have a lot of space. The rent you pay in San Francisco versus the rent you pay in Nevada is day and night. You can rent a mansion in Nevada versus in San Francisco. People are naturally going to choose those environments. And by the way, Nevada has 0% state income tax. So of course, people are going to go there. The question is, these types of incentives, if you consider that package that I presented earlier, if you hit all of those elements, is there anything else left that would make people try to stay in one region versus another? And I think that is the big question right now, because we're not seeing a whole lot. This demarcation between rural and urban gradually disappearing is also a sign of the type of economy that we're in. I think globally, we started with molecular economies where atoms and molecules, it was all about physical stuff. Then gradually we've transitioned to digital economies where it's all about electrons, right? Moving electrons around. And I think we're moving towards neural economies where all of that other stuff with the physical, with digital is going to be automated. Progressively, AI is going to take over. And what it comes down to is the individual ability to adapt and respond to change. And our brains, improving our ability to navigate this new world, becomes the core competency. That is going to be the defining factor that differentiates between a successful rural area versus an unsuccessful rural area. And by unsuccessful, I do not mean not resembling Silicon Valley. I mean future ready. I mean doing true innovation, breakthrough problems solved, not another shampoo manufacturer, because, hey, if they don't do it, the world doesn't miss that shampoo. There are millions of other shampoo manufacturers. But if you have that breakthrough in zeromics, that breakthrough in another area, why not work on that? There's so much abundance in the world. We are producing much more food than we actually need to feed everybody on the planet. Global food adequacy supply, I think, is tracking around 135% last time I checked. That means there's more than enough food to feed everybody, plus 35% left over if aliens want to come over for lunch. The truth is we have bigger problems around transportation, around distribution, and all of that stuff. And again, that's where I think we need to upgrade our collective imagination.
Excellent. Please don't take it against me. I'll play a bit of a devil's advocate.
Please.
Continue to push you on the front. One of the things that was mentioned was also, these these areas are, first, just to say, we are, the OECD's work is completely on board on the, trying to go beyond the urban and rural kind of dichotomy that, this is even already this is kind of an obsolete concept, because there are so many different kinds of rural. But one term that you mentioned, I think worth kind of remembering, which is geographic liberation. It's perhaps something we can take on board. But on the challenge that I mentioned before, the traditional communities, the local customs, how the companies that you mentioned, these are, the culture of these companies is very adaptive in itself. These are the most agile, the strongest, the most dynamic companies. But, have you ever done work with different kinds of companies which are more traditional? What would be the challenge? Again, I'm coming back to the how to really change, how to unlearn, if I use your words. And also there is a question for a country like India, for example, where it's really, a strong informal sector. The question is, how can your approach of the adaptive economy help in bridging the divide? Let's try to be, a bit more, how big of a challenge, in your view, is this the traditional environment?
I think the most impactful part of our work is where we go to organizations, to environments, to regions where adaptive unlearning is not a core competency. So we actually absolutely love those types of projects, and we've done many of them where there's difficulty in unlearning, because there's always people who are going to say, no, this is not Silicon Valley. Listen, this is never going to happen here. No, we have always done it this way, right? And the risk here is that disruption will happen whether we as policymakers pay attention to it or not. The point is, when it happens on its own without intelligent policy choices, you're going to be caught off guard. When I talk about this pattern of oversupply and massive consolidation of industries, that means the informal economy is going to gradually shrink and shrink and shrink, because a lot of things are going to be obviated. A lot of that abundance is going to hit a very specific category of people very, very hard. I think the policy choices that we have are twofold. We advocate for a two-pronged policy approach. On one hand, we want to protect the downside. And on the other hand, we want to promote the upside. What do I mean by this? Let me give you examples from the US and again from Europe. If you think about the US, there's a policy of promoting the upside, right? It's in the air. Everybody wants to build the next Google. Promoting the upside. Protecting the downside, abysmal. We don't even have universal healthcare. Now, what about Europe? Protecting the downside, fantastic. Amazing social safety net. I think you guys pay around 200% per year in taxes, right? Now, promoting the upside, that's a different story. Not a whole lot of that going on. In fact, in terms of big technological innovation, Europe has missed out compared to China, compared to Asia Pacific, compared to the US. Now, we have yet to find an economy that does both at the same time. Promote the upside and protect the downside, because not everybody is going to be a trilingual. They can be, but it's going to take a little while. So you need to protect the downside. That's where schemes like UBI, collective reskilling and upskilling, and this push for policy-oriented unlearning comes into play in adapted economies. But promoting the upside needs to be a huge part of that. You cannot just de-risk lives without actually igniting people's imagination to do bigger, to take on bigger risks, take on bigger projects. And I think it's a very exciting moment in human history. People talk about the 1990s and the early 2000s as, our region missed out on the birth of the internet economy. But listen, we just talked about all these other revolutions that are about to take off. So this is why I'm super excited about it. This is the moment to start investing in these regions, start investing in zeromics, start investing in 3D mobility, start investing in a metaverse-friendly region. Because ultimately, if you create that innovation sandbox, if it becomes a safe environment for people to come to your region and innovate, that theme of geographic liberation means suddenly you're going to be much more competitive. And if the guy next to you is innovating and dreaming bigger, chances are you will dream bigger. If your friend becomes fatter, research has shown this. We have longitudinal studies from the Framingham Heart Study. And we found that, look, if your friend becomes fatter, you are 60% likely to gain weight. If your friend stops smoking, you are, I think, 64% likely to stop smoking. If your friend's friend stops smoking, you are much more likely to stop smoking, even though you might have never met that friend of a friend. So these types of proximity-based outcomes, network effects that previously were unquantified, thanks to digital twinning, are beginning to be quantified. And I think the moment you digital twin, the moment you push for digital twinning of people, property, and processes, then suddenly all these types of innovations open up and become feasible. Unless you have that digital twinning, you're not going to be able to do this. Geographic liberation doesn't happen in your part of the world.
So you used one of the words, which is the great convergence. Convergence is a word we use a lot in territorial analysis. You were referring to technologies, but you also used another word which is coming up much more often lately, which is bifurcation. You were referring to more in a social, from a social dimension, but it applies exactly the same as a threat. Also in territorial perspective, which was also one of the questions from chat, basically what to do with the left behind. Now I'll jump forward to that because basically what you answered that just now in the sense that, you know, it's the lower bound that you need to be careful about, arguing, if I understood you correctly, pro this kind of safety net approaches on the social side.
Exactly.
The same would probably apply to the territorial side with these kind of approaches. My question to you, you mentioned that you have spoken to a number of heads of state lately. Is there something that are you optimistic about these kind of approaches being translated into practice?
I'm very optimistic. I'm an eternal optimist, as I mentioned
nature,
earlier.
but I mean,
by nature. No, in terms of observation, look, ultimately, what we're seeing is the fact that people are getting the memo faster than ever before. That's the beauty of the internet. When the modern mirror was invented, we see a paradigm shift in society, because suddenly we see the rise of first-person novels. We see the rise of people asking for private bedrooms instead of collective bedrooms. It's this massive tectonic shift because suddenly there's something reflecting back onto you, an element of yourself. I think the internet, I think digital twinning is doing that at a massive scale. And yes, the first wave of this is this personal obsession with our own reflection. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the influencers who are not really doing anything of value. But we're going to get past this phase. And what I'm seeing, and we see this with people who are beginning to realize the urgency of trilingualism. 3 governments have approached us to help them upgrade their education system in the image of AQ, because they recognize that they have memorization-based education systems or IQ-based education systems. They do not have an AQ-based, adaptability-based, agility-based education system. And look, we can't see the future, but one thing we know is that if the pace of change is accelerating, that's what we need to do. So I wouldn't be having here, investing in this conversation with you and trying to learn from you guys as well as share our insights if I hadn't seen enough evidence that yes, policymakers are paying attention to these. We're beginning to realize that it's no longer a choice, it's no longer nice to have to think about adaptive economies. It's the only path forward. The question is, when will you get on board this train that is gaining momentum? If we jump on this train earlier, the journey will be smoother. If we jump on this train later because we have to, it'll be a little more friction. And that great bifurcation that we're talking about is very real. There is an entire cohort of society that feels left behind from the innovations that we associate with Silicon Valley. Realistically, it's not Silicon Valley, it's actually globally. It's mostly out of China, if we're honest about it. The point is, people feel left behind. They're not prepared for this reality. The best we can do is to help our citizens become trilinguals while also protecting the downside, promoting the upside, and creating an environment where it's an innovation sandbox. It's a safe environment to try and fail. And telling people dream management, imagination management, that should be center stage for every government, regional or national. Because unless your people are dreaming big, you're not achieving as much as they can. So, but I appreciate the direction of your thought, Peter, and certainly informative for me to learn from this discussion as well. So let's continue.
I'll have one last. We're slowly coming to the last question. So I really liked your comment when you said, metaverse, a friendly region. It's something, I just remind the rest, this digital world which is starting to appear by Epic Games. Now, when that was kind of presented by the Singularity University, I think, like less than 2 months ago, I kind of promoted the idea around also and tested the reaction in my circles. And I have to say, it was very kind of reserved, it was, kind of, where do you live? Where do you get that kind of idea? So my final question to you is the following. When would you say that metaverse, or whichever platform is about to win, when would you say that will become the reality? The reason why I'm asking is because I think it's really important for regional and national policymakers to understand the uncredible tempo and dynamics of change which is going around. So with you, working with all these kind of technologies, all of you guys, when do you think we will really start living in this kind of digital world fully?
For me, the metaverse has already arrived. I play ping pong in VR, virtual reality, every day, and I've lost 10 pounds without even trying. So that reality is here for me, but not for everybody. The famous quote, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed." I think the question is, do we want to be ready for this future by embracing it sooner? And yes, it's uncertain. Yes, some of us will look crazy. Peter, you identify with that, right? When you talk about the metaverse, for people who have never experienced it, they're like, what are you talking about? But the point is, that's the type of courage it takes, because initially it's going to look a little crazy. People are not going to see the target you're trying to hit. Genius is trying to hit it, is hitting a target that nobody else can see. And yes, it's a bit of a challenging situation because we want to take risks that are measured, that are calibrated. But what I'm saying is inaction is no longer a choice. What I'm saying is the biggest risk to our regions, to our resilience, is not taking action, not thinking big enough. The future is already here. I'm not saying try to imagine futures that there are no examples for. That would not be prudent in the policy realm. It would be prudent for a corporation trying to innovate, a startup. But in the policy realm, look around. The point is the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And my main recommendation is to not forecast, but retrocast. Retrocasting means independent of current reality. What would be strange not to have happened 10 years from now? What would be strange not to have happened 5 years from now? We run a service called Rent a Disruptor, rentadisruptor.com. And ultimately what we do is we try to create scenarios where we ask people, how would you disrupt this region, this industry, this product, this company? And how would you grow it 10x, tenfold? And when we ask people through a forecasting question, starting now, what do you think will happen that will lead to blah, blah, blah? Completely different category that over-indexes on the incremental innovation, on the current reality, because people get tunnel vision on current reality. But when we frame it as a retrocast, in 10 years' time, what would be strange not to happen? Some of our best predictions have come from that retrocast. And I think that retrocasting attitude, it behooves us to exercise that in the policy domain as well, because it leads to very successful unlearning.
Excellent. I mean, I'm fully on board. I think the whole transformation is actually inevitable. The only question is whether, in your words, if we can really exceed our imagination and make that change work in our favor. That would be kind of my wrap up, which is literally what the OECD, the Regional Development Policy Committee, the Rural Policy Working Party that we're trying to kind of promote, that with active involvement we can get to the better future, which is what today's discussion I think was about at the core. I mean, I thank you sincerely. I really enjoyed today's discussion. However, it is not for me to close this session. I would also like to thank you in the name of the Working Party, which I chair at the OECD, also for the invitation to the adaptability.org. I think it's an excellent way forward, and I hope that also within the advisory group we will find and explore new ways how we can promote this kind of thinking. Thank you again. That's all on my side, and I pass the word back to Enrique and Nadim.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for passing the floor, and thank you, Amin, for your very insightful, dense presentation. You're right, the 60 minutes went quite fast. So I'm not going to give a long concluding remarks. I just think some of the messages that you gave kind of reinforce a little bit the work that we've been trying to do at the OECD. I mean, we come from a long history of unlearning the traditional sense of rural development. I remember some years ago, there was this stereotype that rural was agriculture and rural was decline, when in fact, when we start to look at some of the numbers and the figures, we found that not all rural is agriculture. There's many richness and diversity in some of these rural, and not all of them are declining. However, if we look at the aggregate pictures, we see that since the global financial crisis, the gaps between rural and the bigger cities has been increasing. And what if you ask yourself what's the problem with this increasing gap? Well, actually, people are living in a lot of these rural areas. So I think from our side, some of the comments that you made, that some of these, the COVID environment is making some of these existing trends even bigger. We also expect from that trend to kind of like create even more winners and losers. So from our end is a bit, what to do about that. How should policy approach this increasing gap? And I think what we've been trying to do is to focus on sort of like creating that environment that you mentioned before. We've been putting a lot of emphasis around trying to understand how innovation can also happen in some of these rural areas, how to better deliver services with new technologies. And I think from some of the technological changes that you mentioned, these internet from above, 3D mobility, these new business models are really going to transform societies. But I think they also go around one key aspect that is relevant for rural, which is the decoupling of production methods. And we already seen how the global value chains have dispersed production across the globe, offering new opportunities, but also delivering services and reducing transportation costs that have been sort of like the Achilles heels of some of these rural places. So I think some of these areas have a lot of amenities and competitive advantages that you mentioned before, lower housing costs, amenities, environment, and so forth, that a lot of these transportations can actually bring many opportunities. And in fact, from our end, we very much approach it from the angle that you have mentioned before around opportunities and trying to focus on the individual. So I think we've been trying to go from a policy that is a bit reactive to kind of like reacting against some of these gaps with many times subsidies and temporary measures, towards one that is more anticipatory, that can adapt, that can predict, that can create an environment that can, even if you have that bifurcation of winners and losers, can we also have some winners on the rural side? Can you identify some of the opportunities? So I think it encourages a lot some of the work that we've been doing. And I really like your comments around the power of policy and intervention and the need to create experiments and possibilities for failure. I think that's very important for us to not think that we have the philosophical stone and need to get the policies the right way, but to come up with a little bit of a flexible approach and try different places and be open to understand whether they work or not, and try to also adapt and make them sort of like future-proof, and make sure that we are creating that environment that can facilitate these trilinguals and all the elements that you mentioned that leads to entrepreneurship and innovation. So I think that's from my end. But before I close it off, maybe I'll just give the floor to Nadim, our deputy, to say the final words.
Well, I mean, perhaps the only final words I really want to say is to say an enormous thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed the presentation. It was excellent, dynamic, and provided an awful lot of momentum for our thinking. I mean, perhaps it also provided some ideas for further thought. I mean, one of the things that came to mind during your presentation, of course, is that how do we manage some of the disruptive innovators and some of the negative consequences that we may see? I think a large part of disruptive innovation, when we think about, of course, is driven through the lens or the prism of basically how we can expand the economy. There's a monetary aspect to it. And I think that what we also need to be cognizant of in that transformation is what the impacts of these innovators are on well-being, on issues like resilience. I mean, perhaps one of the questions that I would like to ask you, but perhaps it's a question for a follow-up, is how do we recognize that not all of the disruptive innovators are necessarily going to provide us with full clarity during that moment of innovation or the disruption. And so the example I thought of when you were talking was the straw, the plastic straw. So there was a disruptive innovation, one that we saw picked up everywhere, but the costs of the plastic straw only became apparent to us many years down the line. So of course, how do we anticipate the negative externalities of disruptive innovation in the system? What can we do to make sure that we can future-proof even that aspect of it? And that's perhaps another million-dollar question, but one that perhaps we can have the benefit of hearing from you at another event. I really enjoyed this one, really enjoyed hearing from you, really enjoyed the questions, and I thought that your chairing, Peter, was absolutely first class. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much. So grateful for the opportunity to spend time with you. And yes, absolutely welcome the opportunity to spend more time in the future. Please do count on me and my team as a resource. Thanks again.